Good afternoon, students, faculty, and community members, and welcome to Policy Talks, the School of Policy Studies weekly speaker series. My name is Adrienne Epprecht, and I am a member of the MPA class of 2019. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Robert Wolfe here to speak with us about the USMCA, aka the new Nafta. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. To acknowledge this traditional territory is to recognize its longer history and its significance for the Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live here. Now I'd like to introduce Professor Emeritus Dr. Robert Wolfe. From 1976 to 1995, he was a Foreign Service Officer with the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. During that time, he served abroad in Bangladesh and in the Canadian delegation to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. In Ottawa, he worked in the National Security Section, the U.S. Trade and Economic Relations Division, as Executive Assistant to the Ambassador for Multilateral Trade Negotiations and the Prime Minister's personal representative, the Economic Summit, and the International Economic Relations Division. After retiring from the public service, he joined the School of Policy Studies, and I'm sure I can speak for my class in saying we're sorry to have missed his course on international trade policy. Dr. Wolfe is a fellow of the Center for International and Defense Policy at Queen's University, a research fellow of the Institute for Research on Public Policy, a member of the editorial board of World Trade Review, and a member of the Trade Expert Advisory Council for Global Affairs Canada. Finally, he is lead director of the annual Queen's Institute on Trade Policy, which last week marked 10 years of bringing together former negotiators, academic trade experts, and the new generation of policy practitioners for training, networking, and a series of insightful talks. In light of what has been a dramatic last few months in the world of trade negotiations, Dr. Wolfe's talk today is sure to spark discussion. As in the past, we will be using Slido to ask these questions. For those unfamiliar, you can submit your questions by going to the Slido website directly or using the app on your phone. The code for today is MPA 19. Please ask questions throughout the talk, and even if you don't have a question, take a moment to upvote the questions that interest you. We'll also be taking a few live questions from the audience, and if you are watching the live stream right now, you can also participate on Slido. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Wolfe.
Well, thank you very much. Did I get this turned on? Is it working, Dave? Great. So, like Adrienne, I think it's important always to remember that we are on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. If you were lucky enough to hear Hayden King last night, you know that Aboriginal people, Indigenous people in this territory had their own treaty relations, their own ideas of international trade, and we shouldn't forget that. And indeed, Canada's negotiators didn't forget it when they were doing the new Nafta. The results on Indigenous issues are pretty good. Many sections reference Indigenous rights. The most valuable is the General Exceptions chapter, which makes clear that nothing in the new agreement precludes any trade measure that's necessary to fulfill Canada's legal obligations to Indigenous peoples. So is the New Deal merely the old Nafta, but less? My answers will necessarily be nuanced, but here's the quick answer, and if you've had your lunch and want to leave now, here you go. USMCA is a little less than Nafta, especially as you'll see on some of the managed trade aspects, but it's a little bit more than the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that in itself was more than Nafta. It avoids the worst of what President Trump wants, and I'll talk a bit about that. Perhaps most important, just getting it done reduces the considerable uncertainty that was being faced by investors and traders in this country. So on balance, it's not bad, which is a considerable achievement if it gets through Congress, and that's where I'll end up. In a little more detail, I'll talk about the overview of where we started on this, a broad context, some of the objectives on both sides. the so-called poison pills that blocked progress for a long time in the negotiations, how it was modernized, what kinds of provisions are there to bring it to life, a final assessment, and then where do we go now? So, and you're allowed to laugh at the cartoons. I put them in there, so it's okay. Yeah. It turns out that Trump wanted rather more than the few tweaks that he promised Prime Minister Trudeau just after he took office, but he didn't smash it. Canada's insistence on at least talking about what the minister called the progressive trade agenda was never an obstacle in the negotiations, nor did the Americans laugh. And indeed, we got many aspects of it, as you just saw on Indigenous issues. Critics poke fun at the Prime Minister for the deal. So is it fair to claim that we lost our pants? Well, it's supposed to be funny. How you answer the question is partly a partisan issue. Canadians overall are dubious. 45% of Canadians claim to be disappointed, and only 34% are pleased. Liberals think it's pretty good. That's 51% of Liberals think it's a good deal, and they think on other results from the same survey, they think the PM did a pretty good job negotiating. Conservatives, on the other hand, have to believe Andrew Scheer, who said, without any evidence whatsoever, that he could have negotiated a better deal. So what we often observe on opinion about trade is that partisan divides actually drive opinion about trade and not the other way around. So interpretation is hard. You have to think about what you would compare USMCA to. So there was no chance that the status quo was going to be the result of this negotiation. We weren't going to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership because Trump pulled out as soon as he started. The initial US offer was horrible, so good thing we didn't get that. And well, you could compare it, if you want, to an ideal trade agreement that reduces uncertainty by creating a modern set of commercial policy rules, and you can find that in some other universe, but that wasn't an offer either. So the complete agreement, without the hundreds of pages of tariff schedules, is over 1,100 pages. You'll be relieved to know that I'm not going to comment on each of the 34 chapters, 11 annexes, and 12 side letters. But before discussing some of what is in the agreement, we need to recall the context. Canada did not choose to renegotiate Nafta. Like everybody else, we're simply responding to Trump. He carried on, he started out by withdrawing from TPP. He carried on by demanding unacceptable changes to Nafta, by refusing to appoint new members to the appellate body in the WTO, threatening car tariffs on the European Union if they didn't agree to talk, launching a trade war with China. And yet, as we know, trade wars actually hurt your own people, particularly farmers, more than anybody else. But here we are. During his election campaign, Trump promised to fix Nafta. As a candidate in 2008, Hillary Clinton promised to fix Nafta. She said she'd pull out if she couldn't do it, and her opponent also had to make noises about Nafta. So before we get too excited about Trump, and there's lots of reasons to be excited about Trump, Nafta had become a toxic brand in the United States, and that was part of the context. But Trump is unusual. So to understand how the renegotiation unfolded, we need to understand how something about how his administration sees trade. He believes that foreign market barriers are unfair to the United States. The trade deals negotiated by all his predecessors, Republican and Democrat, they're stacked against Americans. The US trade deficit is evidence of this unfairness. He thinks exports are good, so they're kind of like revenues. And he thinks imports are bad. That's kind of like costs that you pay. Economists think this way of thinking about trade is laughable, but there we are. And he thinks access to the United States market is a privilege, and other countries not only should pay for it, but they should be paying more for it. Okay? Robert Lighthizer is his trade ambassador, the United States Trade Representative. He previously worked in the office of the USTR in the 1980s, and then he went into private practice for a couple of decades, where he worked for declining industries like the steel industry. And he surrounded himself as USTR with people who agree with him that you need to have anti-dumping laws and exploit them to protect declining industries. So he is on record as thinking that US trade policy has been all wrong since 1994 when the World Trade Organization agreements came into effect. He thinks it's a mistake, the WTO, thinks it has to be fixed. Probably most important, he thinks international courts should not constrain the United States. He believes that China is an existential threat, not only to the United States, but to the whole world economy. And he believes, in terms of his negotiating approach, that life was good in the 1980s when President Reagan could just bully trading partners into agreeing with the United States, or so he thought. Lighthizer says if you have enormous, unprecedentedly large deficits that go on for decades, you're basically losing your jobs, you're losing your wealth. And he may be right that that's what the president thinks. They're both wrong on the economics and on the facts, but they're not going to change. In fact, in a recent letter to Congress announcing that he wanted to have trade negotiations with Japan, he still sees the goods deficit as a problem caused by tariff and non-tariff barriers, and he never mentions trade and services. The biggest risk to Canada from Trump is a thicker border with our largest trading partner. If they want to talk, we don't have a choice. So we found ourselves in a negotiation at the demand of the United States that was intended first to modernize Nafta. Of course, that's what we did in TPP. We would have been quite happy if they just signed TPP, said NAFTA's modernized, on we go. But in any event, we thought the modernization part of the USTR objective was going to be easy. The second part, the intent to reduce the non-existent trade deficit, can't be done with a trade agreement. And so this impossible objective led to some crazy demands at the outset. These objectives were calibrated to appeal to labor, to Democrats, and to Trump, using automobile rules of origin to bring jobs back, strong labor and environment chapters, getting rid of any constraints on the ability to have Buy America rules that said contracts can only go to American firms. They certainly wanted to stop anything we were doing to protect our dairy producers. Yes, okay, for the business community, we'll lock in TPP, but that was never something the administration was much interested in. The president, to mollify the president, they said after 5 years, if the trade deficit isn't where we want it to be, we can just sunset the agreement, and we'll just make the dispute settlement system advisory instead of in any way binding. Not surprisingly, Canada's first objective was just to preserve what we could, and then get whatever modernization was possible. The US business community shared those objectives, and the business community actually mostly shared our objective to try to get rid of the so-called national security tariffs on steel and aluminum. That was a huge objective for us because of the way that was depressing investment in those industries. Ultimately, our objective was to rag the puck until Lighthizer dropped his poison pills, which means don't rush here. Let's just make some solid proposals and play this thing out. Some people, opponents of the Prime Minister, like to say that the negotiations were going slowly because of American pique with the Prime Minister and with Minister Freeland. Those people never explained why rushing into a deal, capitulating to Lighthizer's crazy demands, why that would have been in Canada's interests. And of course, the Mexican approach was largely similar to ours. They have the same problems. I can't discuss every outcome in the agreement, but I will discuss some of the most difficult issues and some of the most controversial outcomes in the agreement. This image of where the parts of a Volvo come from illustrates how auto assembly plants are merely the last link in a complex global value chain. Rules of origin define what's required in an FTA for goods to be originating within the free trade area and hence qualify for tariff preferences. An engine originating in Mexico with a suspension originating in the United States and a transmission made in Canada, you put all that together in an assembly plant in any one of the three countries, and that becomes a Nafta product or now a USMCA product. The rule of origin was a threshold issue. It was one of the big holdups in the negotiation, went on for a long time, and it was in the end largely a Mexico-US problem. The current rule of origin requires 62.5% of a car to be of Nafta origin, based largely on a tracing list of physical parts that were typically found in cars of the early 1980s, like a cassette deck. The US wanted to move to an 85% Nafta content with 50% American content in the car. That was intended to bring production and investment back to the US, but the US industry hated it because of the way that would disrupt the complex value chains that cross all three borders all the time. And since the tariff for non-NAFTA countries is only 2.5%, the bigger risk was that playing around with these kinds of rules of origin would actually just have people bringing in cars from outside the NAFTA area. In any event, this was simply an unacceptable basis for proceeding for Canada and Mexico. So where did we end up? We agreed to a 75% content level, so a little bit of an increase for cars and trucks. And on the core parts of a car, 75% or 70% of the steel and aluminum has to be NAFTA or USMCA origin. And the innovation was something called labor value content, and we bear Canadian fingerprints are on this one. 40 to 45% of cars and trucks have to be made by workers who earn at least $16 an hour. The Americans figured that's great. Mexican plants pay much less. The jobs will come north. Of course, there's a lot of US auto plants in right-to-work states that aren't paying that much now, so it's going to have interesting effects. The part that was particularly important for Canada was saying you can credit money that's spent on R&D and technology development, in other words, the things that might keep the North American industry competitive. So John Holmes is here. I should just let him come up and talk about this because I'm just stealing some of his ideas on how you think about the outcome. But basically, the industry's relieved by this. It goes backward from where we are, but it could have been much worse. It's more restrictive, it's cumbersome, it's going to increase administrative costs for the industry. It'll likely decrease the competitiveness of the North American industry. So cars will become more expensive. You won't be able to export those cars anywhere else because they will become more expensive relative to the world. And offshore cars will have a competitive advantage in the North American market. We might see a slight increase in manufacturing because, for the most part, we can easily meet that $16 an hour US wage, and so that may force some production out of Mexico. Anyway. NAFTA's rules on government procurement are weak. The WTO rules are much more important and much better. Democrats in Congress want stronger provisions so that contracts for public infrastructure go to American firms. Our chief negotiator said that the initial American proposal may well have been the worst ever put forth in a trade negotiation. They never made it public, but Steve's a calm guy. You can imagine how wonderful it must have been. Over time, the US dropped the worst elements, but Canada made no progress on market access in the government procurement chapter, so there is a clause in there saying it doesn't apply to Canada. We opted out. We'll just use the WTO rules for government procurement. Trump keeps saying that Canada is unfair on agriculture, but the US has a surplus on agriculture trade. It has a surplus on dairy trade, despite what he thinks of as high tariffs. And of course, Americans provide significant support to their own farmers, who thereby produce a huge surplus, which they try to dump on world markets, including Canada. And that surplus is enormous. And you have to remember that Wisconsin alone produces more milk than all of Canada. So dairy was what it was always going to be. We knew where we got to in TPP. What we did in USMCA was what's called a tariff rate quota, so they don't just get reduced tariffs. For an amount equal to 3.59% of the Canadian market, they can now export tariff-free, but most of that is allocated for industrial milk, for milk used in processing, not for fluid milk. That in itself won't kill supply management, but there are things in there that would require it to change something called Class 7 ingredient pricing, and trust me, you don't want to know more than what I've just said. But that's a keystone of the whole supply management system, and so getting rid of it could destabilize the system. Lots of critics of supply management, mostly on the right, but not only, say that supply management has led to an inefficient dairy industry that costs consumers too much money, which may be true, and you may like to think that Canada, for its own reasons, should start providing adjustment assistance to dairy farmers to go to a more modern system. That's not what the government's going to do. It's just going to compensate dairy farmers, and this little bit of access to Canada is not going to help with that big US surplus in milk. There is a Kingston connection. If there is a provision that says if Canada exceeds export volumes on something we hardly export at all at the moment, which includes infant formula, then there would be an export tax an equivalent to an export tax. It's highly unusual in a trade agreement to do something like that. You could wish it wasn't there, but it's not going to make much difference because the negotiators knew exactly how much dairy-based infant formula this plant needed to export in its early years. So the cap is above that, and in the long run, they're going to be exporting goat milk infant formula to China and not dairy milk. Express delivery was a big US ask. If you ship a little package into the United States, it doesn't attract customs attention until it's worth more than $800. Canadian retailers said if we do that in Canada, we're dead. Although consumers might be happy if you could have that kind of a limit. In the end, the compromise was that there would be no duties for goods imported to Canada by couriers under $150 Canadian, and no sales taxes, no HST, on shipments under $40. And they're going to be streamlining some of the procedures at the border for courier companies. You might wonder why these provisions don't apply to Canada Post, because lots of things come in the mail. Well, the reason is that this provision was something that FedEx and other companies had been lobbying hard for. The Americans never mentioned Canada Post going to the negotiators, so it's not in the agreement. Is the intellectual property chapter a terrible thing for Canada? Some critics of the agreement think it is. Probably the most important point here is that, like TPP, it would change very little in Canadian intellectual property law. Whether or not that law is a good thing is not the point. Nothing much changes. The big thing that changes is the increase in data exclusivity for biologics. That may well cost Canadians money, although it's not clear yet. Probably the big thing for negotiators is that from an economic efficiency standpoint, it doesn't actually have much effect on Canadian productivity. The increase in copyright term pleases people like musicians who own copyrights, doesn't please people who pay for copyrights. Probably one of the most complicated and controversial is restrictions on intermediary liability for internet firms. There was a case, it's called the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in the United States, that basically says Google isn't liable if you post something defamatory or salacious or whatever on the internet. And they wanted, the internet companies in the United States wanted USMCA to protect that. And Canada said, you can put that in the agreement if you need it for domestic purposes. We don't have that problem, we don't want it, and so there's a footnote that basically says it doesn't apply in Canada. So yes, intermediary liability is a weird thing, and it may not be a good thing, but it doesn't affect us. Article 3210 of USMCA has everybody debating whether we're even allowed to launch negotiations with China. Paragraph 4 says entry by any party into a free trade agreement with a non-market country, that means China, shall allow the other parties to terminate this agreement on 6-month notice, which they can do anyway, and replace it with a bilateral agreement, which would be curious because the rules of origin for automobiles really assume a trilateral agreement. So having only the United States and Mexico would be a very complicated thing. In any event, China will soon be the largest economy in the world, so of course we should talk to them, and we will. 3210 makes no difference to the calculation of whether we'll talk to them. Canadian negotiators know without being told that the Americans are hypersensitive to any talk about trade with China. We know that if we undermine their trade war by using a bilateral agreement with China to increase our trade with China at their expense, they won't be happy with us. We don't need 3210 to tell us that. But this provision does not prevent the slow process of deepening engagement, which may lead to an FTA when both sides are ready, but neither are at the moment. So this is a symbol not anything real. A lot of people in the US Congress, some people in US trade unions, are convinced that other countries manipulate their exchange rate in order to trade unfairly with the United States. And so they like now to put a currency provision in their agreements. What they put into the USMCA is similar to the same thing that's in TPP. It would be better not to have it in the trade agreement, there's no question. The US wanted this symbolism, but here too, the impact is going to be quite minimal because we all have the kind of floating exchange rates that the provision imagines, and we all meet the transparency and reporting requirements already. So Lighthizer wanted a provision in the agreement that would allow the president to withdraw after 5 years. That was an awful idea. Whatever certainty you would get by having an agreement would go right back out the window if you thought, oh, I'm supposed to invest $1 billion in an automobile agreement, but in 5 years the president could cancel the deal. Hopeless. But Mexico caved to some extent in August, and it wasn't something that we fought on in September. So the result is very complicated. And the best way to think of it is we've just kicked the can down the road 1 or 2 presidencies into the future, when we hope there will be a president who's not so anxious about trade. There's a requirement for, the agreement lasts at least 16 years. It will be reviewed in 6 years. If everybody's happy at that point, it lasts for another 16 years. It's kind of a rolling, kicking it down the road. Trump loves Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, which allows you to counter threats to national security with tariffs. He doesn't actually care about national security. He just wanted to have some way to use tariffs. So there is, in fact, in the agreement, a provision on essential security, which says nothing shall be used to preclude a country from applying measures that it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interests on its own with no criteria. That language comes from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, so you would think it's okay, except the GATT provision adds that by necessary it means relating to fissionable materials or traffic in arms or taken in a time of war, which does not apply to steel and aluminum being exported from Canada. So famously, Trump imposed 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada and Mexico in the spring. One of our big objectives was to get rid of it and to get some insulation from future ones. Trump undermined the supposed national security basis for these tariffs by saying that actually one purpose was to force a Nafta outcome. It wasn't addressed, for the most part, in USMCA, except for a side letter on the process for any future 232 tariffs in general, plus a very high quota for autos if there was ever a 232 on autos. This is a really dumb process, and indeed Mexico has said that it may not even sign the agreement if Trump doesn't end these steel and aluminum tariffs, which are completely spurious. The last time that a reporter asked the Prime Minister, he said, so we'll see if we go along with Mexico on that one. So briefly, some of the modernization issues that were achieved in the agreement. Good regulations are now really important for reducing trade costs. So for example, you want the auto parts that are crisscrossing the border to be assembled into a whole car to kind of meet the same standard for how a headlight works or brakes or whatever, but it goes much beyond that. This chapter, however, is just best endeavors. The only point of it is to develop better procedures at home. And it's another case where it's nice boilerplate. It requires no change to the Cabinet Directive on Regulation. And it doesn't get at any process of deeper engagement between regulatory agencies that would get to some form of alignment, which would be a good objective. Services trade is mostly about regulatory cooperation. Canada is the black bar here. The rest of the OECD is gray. And what you see at the very top is that services is the largest part of employment in Canada. Trump doesn't even think about services when he thinks about the deficit. Even if the share of manufacturing in employment was increased by his trade policies, it would have little overall impact. On the bottom line of this chart, pure services exports are only 16% of our gross exports, but look at the second bottom line. 40% of the value added in Canada to the things we export is services. Sadly, services was lost in the crossfire in these negotiations. It doesn't interest Trump or Lighthizer. Very little progress was made. One of the biggies for us, one of the achievements of the original Nafta, was provisions of temporary entry for service professionals, like an engineer who has to go to install or service a piece of equipment. The categories of service professionals that made sense in the early 1990s don't make sense anymore. We wanted to expand that list. But guess what? This sounds like immigration and not something the Americans wanted to talk about. So just leaving that alone was actually good. Some improvement to financial services. And of course, digital trade is largely about services, and there was action. It's a truth universally acknowledged that every FTA now has to have a chapter on e-commerce, and there are dozens of them. In those agreements, there's a recognition that times have changed since the early 1990s. You may recall this famous cartoon on the internet, "Nobody knows you're a dog." Well, now they do. So we all worry about how Google follows us around. Negotiators are still learning about how to put digital provisions into a trade agreement, which is why so much of USMCA, like TPP, is best endeavors. You do your best. As opposed to being cast in obligatory language like some of the things on the left, the things I've highlighted are changes in USMCA from TPP. In other words, not much changed. Given the US privacy patchwork and the differing legal systems in the three countries, protection of personal information is just best endeavors. Data flows and data localization are more technical, but they have a big impact on the ability to trade electronically in the 21st century, and they've been more controversial. In other words, some people think those provisions compromise Canadian regulatory sovereignty. Americans think that the choice of technology and server location should be a commercial issue, not a regulatory issue. They may be right in principle. In any event, USMCA tries to prohibit both restrictions on cross-border transfer of data and requirements for data localization, that is, keeping a server in Canada. And so some people say, does that means we can't impose restrictions on those things for legitimate public policy purposes? And I think that's wrong. Government procurement, which for example would apply to BC rules on where health data can be stored, it's simply eliminated from the digital chapter by the scope article. Information held or processed by or on behalf of a government is excluded from the chapter. So all of those privacy concerns simply don't arise because of USMCA. And both the provisions on data flow and server location can be overridden when necessary for a legitimate public purpose like privacy. So I don't see much for concern on behalf of Canadians in those provisions. Can the agreement be brought to life? Nice to have a piece of paper. Will it work? One test of that problem is whether there is the possibility of verification by all the parties that national law, the policies in place, the way the rules are implemented, that all of that is consistent with the obligations that you took in the trade agreement. The gold standard, which is not perfect, that's why Canada had a ministerial last week on WTO reform, but the gold standard is the WTO. There are provisions where you have to notify any change in policy. Those notifications can be discussed in a committee. If you still don't agree, there's a provision for dispute settlement, and there's a strong secretariat to support all of that process. So USMCA creates the Free Trade Commission of Ministers to oversee 21 committees, 2 subcommittees, 1 working group. In all of the agreements, there's commitments on various forms of information that ought to be provided by somebody somehow, but there are no formal notifications except in certain cases where the agreements say, well, you have to notify this to the WTO, so tell your USMCA partners about it at the same time. All the committees are supposed to meet 1 year after the agreement comes into force. They're said, oh, you can provide a forum for this or for that. Some are even said, well, you'd better monitor the implementation of your chapter. But there's no provision that says a committee is supposed to receive formal notifications or to review those notifications. There's no secretariat to assemble such data or provide background documents. In other words, like the committees in Nafta, like the committees in most regional trade agreements, these committees are going to exist on paper, I suspect, and they'll be used. You know, when a problem arises, people will say, let's have a meeting of the committee so we can deal with the problem, but it's not going to be a robust way of bringing the agreement to life. I said dispute settlement was part of the institutional provision, which is why it's here and not with poison pills. Lighthizer hates dispute settlement. He said, what sovereign nation would trust to arbitrators or the flip of a coin their entire defense against unfair trade? Canada claimed that the US proposals would simply make the agreement unenforceable. So I'm using here the numbers from Nafta, not the new numbers in USMCA. Chapter 11 was about the settlement arbitration of disputes between investors and states. It's been controversial in Europe, in Canada, in Mexico. Lighthizer doesn't like it. He wanted to make it optional. In the event, it's limited for Mexico still. It's still there, but limited. And Canada simply opted out of it instead of accepting what Lighthizer wanted. The famous Chapter 19, the binational panel review of domestic trade remedy actions, Lighthizer wanted to simply get rid of it. It was a red line for Canada. It's unchanged. Chapter 20 is the interpretation of how NAFTA works, the state-to-state process. It hasn't been used since 2001 because it turns out the rules were badly written and you can't actually create a panel. There's some tweaks in there that might now make it possible to create a panel, but in any event, it hasn't changed either. So on dispute settlement, we gave nothing away. That means we can have future discussions in the WTO about how to improve dispute settlement without anybody saying, well, you gave the store away in USMCA, or we can improve USMCA itself in future. The government made Chapter 19 a red line. Why? Because the remedy is retrospective. If the United States has been unfairly collecting duties from us and we win a Chapter 19 case, they have to give it back. Any other dispute settlement, the result is simply you got to change what you're doing. And it has some impact because American officials know it's there, and so that keeps their toes to the fire in implementing the agreements properly. So I said at the outset, the agreement is a considerable achievement, and my standard of comparison obviously is mostly whether it forces us to change our existing policies and not whether it forces us to pursue better policies. Some parts of the agreement go backwards from NAFTA. The rules of origin, as I've said, there's not even any free trade in the name anymore. The tolerance of managed trade in the 232 side letters is not great. There are things like the provisions on China and currency and the review clause that I would just as soon not see in a trade agreement. But the most valuable parts of NAFTA have been preserved. Most notably, market access. Tariff-free trade in North America under NAFTA, that continues. The culture exemption was important to the government, and that continues. And many of the parts of it make an advance on the TPP chapters, so there is some modernization. That is, there are new rules in the agreement on digital trade and other issues. So what happens now? This chart shows all the steps to congressional approval. Right now, negotiators are doing what's called a legal scrub, just making sure that everything fits together and the language is what they want it to be. We're almost at the point in the green section where the agreement gets signed, but there are lots of hoops to go through before it can become part of US law. The key steps, the US ITC has 105 calendar days for an economic assessment of the effects of the agreement. They're going to have a hearing in November. They're allowing written comments to come in up almost till Christmas. That means they'll have a report probably in March, and somewhere, and Congress won't take it up until they get that report. At some point, probably in the new year, the government has to table implementing legislation with a new Congress. So this ratification is not going to be a problem in Mexico and probably not going to be difficult in Canada. But what happens on Tuesday will have a big impact. If we get more Democrats in Congress or more Republicans hostile to trade in Congress, ratification will not be easy. Building allies in Congress is always essential for any policy change. Before the negotiations concluded, our task, and we worked really hard at it with a full court press on governors, on the press, on members of Congress, was to make sure that there were enough people in the Republican Party who said to Trump, you got to keep Canada in the deal and you got to conclude the deal. That was a vital step. Now the challenge will be convincing enough people who are skeptical of trade to hold their noses and pass the deal anyway, because it would be better for us if this deal goes through. The agreement is designed, provisions on labor and the environment, for example, to mollify some of the likely opponents. In any event, we have a large team in our embassy in Washington who watches every twitch of an eyebrow among members of Congress, trying to gauge where there's a problem and provide them information on why it's a good deal. Playing this game in Washington politics is nothing new. Those of you who heard my Gibson lecture in the spring will recall Alan Gottlieb's 2 rules that he learned about life in Washington. He was ambassador in the 1980s, you may recall. His first rule, and this certainly applies to USMCA at this point, is it's not over until it's over. The second rule of Washington is it's never over. So you may be sick and tired about hearing Nafta 2.2 or USMCA or USMCeh, but it's not going away anytime soon. Thank you. I think the first question is, what would an ideal agreement look like for Canada? Well, it would have much better provisions on trade and services, particularly on temporary entry, but there's all sorts of ways in which the way you thought about services in the 1990s is not the way to think about services today. It would not have complicated rules of origin for automobile trade. It would it would probably have stronger provisions on the environment. What's in that chapter is actually fairly weak. Lots of discussion there about fisheries subsidies, but the WTO will go faster on fish. There's no real, you would certainly have a set of committees that would have a secretariat to support them, and they could meet more often. So there's many ways in which you could have a more modern agreement than this one will prove to be. Yes, they will do both. And so the thing to watch, and the administration will quite rightly say you can't start picking open the agreement. If you do that, it all falls apart and we're back to square one. It would be disastrous in Mexico because the incoming president has basically fired 2/3 of the Mexican negotiating team. So if you wanted to start renegotiating the agreement with the Mexicans, it would take them months and months even to be ready to do that. So a very bad idea. So you can be sure that Canadian officials will be looking very carefully at the US implementing legislation to be sure that not too much gets snuck into there that's contrary to the agreement. And they'll be looking at what's called the Statement of Administrative Action. Both of those are ways in which a Democratic majority in Congress could say, fix these things that we don't like in the agreement. The new Mexican government, the president was elected July 1, takes office December 1. which is why this agreement will be signed on November 29th or November 30th. His team watched the final negotiations very closely. They signaled they were comfortable with where it was going. But who knows what the pressures would be on them, very different, coming from a very different political place. So they were just as happy to get this done with the current administration and not have to take the blame for what was negotiated. So the deal, it became quite clear that the bottom line on timing was to get the outgoing president to sign it, which has to be November 29th or 30th, which meant the deal under US law had to be notified to Congress by the end of September, so that forced the pace. Did it change? This is mostly procedural. Did it have much effect on substance? Probably not. Is protectionism always bad? Well, that's one of the classic cases where, as an academic, I would say you have to define protectionism. So if you think that measures that protect workers from the worst effects of an untrammeled free market, like labor standards, basic laws making it possible for people to organize as unions and be respected in that, laws that protect food safety, laws that protect the environment, if that's what you mean by protectionism, no, it's not always bad. If you mean trying to use trade policy to keep all the benefits of trade for yourself and all the costs of trade you push onto countries somewhere else, that is always bad, and it ends up hurting both sides. The only point where that's marginally true is on, I've forgotten the name for it. There's a bovine growth hormone that's allowed in the United States and not, so pushes cows to make more milk. Health Canada has never authorized it. So so that milk actually can't be imported to Canada if it has any trace of that hormone. Aside from that, no. Canada and the US have very similar rules for food safety and animal health and human health. The regulatory systems, the people work very closely together. In most areas, there's no particular reason to think that a product that is thought safe to eat or drink in the US would not be safe in Canada. The charm offensive, I think, was vital. It was what prevented the administration from simply rolling over Canada. One of the reasons that Canada appeared to be ragging the puck, and we did, we put in some very detailed and complicated proposals that took time to discuss in meeting after meeting, knowing that in many cases the Americans weren't going to accept them because it's not where Lighthizer and Trump wanted to go. So we did things that did take time because we needed to give the charm offensive a chance to work. And if anybody ever doubted the need for it and the effectiveness of it, it came at the end of August, the beginning of September, when Lighthizer and Trump tried to jam us into the boards. I shouldn't use hockey metaphors. I don't watch hockey enough to be good at it. They tried to put us in a corner. They said, we've done a deal with Mexico. What was announced with Mexico was pretty weird, not complete. They said, we've done a deal with Mexico, sign on now or we'll just go ahead without you. One of the reasons that didn't happen is because of a chorus of members of Congress, of journalists, of governors who said, no, 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 that's a really bad idea. And the business community said that. And some of them knew very well why it would be a bad idea. They knew, without being told, that Canada was a much more important trading partner for most states and most businesses than Mexico. But Canada made very sure that everybody who had the possibility to give voice to these concerns, we made sure they all knew that. And so they all stood up and said, oh, try to get a deal with Canada, that matters. And that was crucial, I think, in the end game in September. Scheer, on this, I won't say about anything else, he was just posturing. I think he said that at a point where he had absolutely no idea what he was saying. And in any event, if the new agreement has not gone through the US Congress by the time of the Canadian election, it's going to have bigger problems than whether or not Scheer likes it. My guess is it'll be done by summer. At least I hope that's the case.
Yes, we should take a few questions from the audience as well.
So, in your opinion, do you think that...
Can you stand up and shout? Because...
So, I'm just going to... So, in your opinion, is this deal a good deal from a Canadian perspective? If not, then what would be?
I think it's a considerable achievement for Canada. And in the circumstances, given what was achievable with this American administration, it was great. Couldn't have done better. Would I have preferred Trump to simply sign TPP? Yes. Not a great deal, but anything that was good from a Nafta standpoint in this renegotiation, we'd already done in TPP. So we avoided the worst, and that was given, as we see how easy it is to arrive at the worst south of the border at the moment. I'm very happy that it's not that bad.
Any other questions? Well, we have time for the next question then on, is NAFTA or USMCA a better name?
Well, NAFTA, I've said for 25 years that any agreement with over 1,000 pages shouldn't be called a free trade agreement, because you could write a real free trade agreement on 3 or 4 pages. But the broad objective was liberalization, and it achieved a lot of liberalization. It achieved a big increase in North American trade. So having in the name that as the objective is a good thing. USMCA, aside from being unpronounceable, USMCA is not really polite, but some people think you should change the order of the letters so it would say Camus, and you could have an existential crisis about it. I don't like the name, and I'm not sure I have a better name for this thing.
The USMCA increases the patent period on pharmaceutical drugs. How will this impact the price of pharmaceuticals in Canada, if there is a significant impact?
It's only on biologics, and that's where people are worried that there could be real costs for the Canadian healthcare system because of the change required in Canadian copyright law. Other people say that's not clear. It may lead to a big increase in costs. It may not. But that's about the only place that we're likely to see a cost increase.
With the ratification of the USMCA, will the ratification of the USMCA affect the future of Canada's agreement with the EU?
I don't think so. There's no reason why it should. The only part that's a little uncertain about the deal with Europe is that it's not fully ratified in Europe yet because of the investor-state provisions largely. And it's being implemented provisionally except for the investor-state dispute settlement, which is fine, but it does leave the agreement vulnerable to any government that formally says we're not going to ratify it, which the interesting set of political parties running the government in Italy has threatened to do. But I don't see the deal with Europe actually facing much difficulty, and I don't think USMCA will hurt it.
Some argue that Prime Minister Trudeau did not fight hard enough for Canada in this agreement. Could more have been done, and what would that have looked like?
I have no idea what the people who say that have in mind, so I don't know what more could have been done. I think the government played a bad hand very well.
What will happen if Congress does not pass the USMCA?
At that point, you're having to try to imagine what the current president of the United States will do, and nobody kind of can figure that out for this afternoon. Some months from now, who knows? What he threatened to do in the past was rip up NAFTA, which produced a huge amount of debate among legal scholars as to whether the US Constitution and the text of the US legislation would allow them to do that. There is a withdrawal clause in NAFTA, as there is in USMCA, and the president can simply say, I'm withdrawing from NAFTA. But trade agreements are just pieces of paper. They have no direct effect in national law. They only exist in practice if there is implementing legislation. So there are all kinds of bits of US legislation that give effect to NAFTA. If Congress says, well, you can rip it up, but we're not changing the legislation, then the current NAFTA just carries on. The pressure on Congress to leave NAFTA alone in those circumstances would be intense, just because it actually is a very good agreement for American business and American farmers. So it would be a mess. Would the current president want to try again to renegotiate NAFTA, or would he have different preoccupations given what the shape of Congress might be? I have no idea.
Sunbelt Water Incorporated sued British Columbia for preventing it from exporting our fresh water to California. Will the removal of Chapter 11 increase Canada's sovereignty?
I don't want to get into a debate about investor-state dispute settlement. That could keep us going all day. I don't see those provisions as being an infringement of sovereignty, but in any event, the handful of US firms who've successfully sued Canadian governments won't be able to do that in the future. So that risk is gone.
Maybe I'll open it one more time if there's any questions live from the audience.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could answer that question on whether the USMCA, effective if they end the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, or can we expect them to continue?
Sadly, it does not affect them. It was, as I said on the national security set of slides, that 232 process wasn't really changed by USMCA, largely wasn't meant to. Mexico has said if those tariffs aren't removed by the end of the month, they're not signing the deal. Do they mean it? There are apparently talks going on. We know that the possible outcomes could be nasty. The Americans could say, all right, we'll get rid of the tariffs, but we'll put a quota on you. If they put quotas on us like they put on the Koreans, it would be catastrophic for the industry. The Canadian negotiators know that very well, and they say that's not going to happen. So this is one of the uncertainties about what this president is going to do tomorrow or next week. But obviously, we would like them to be gone, but we don't know.
We've got time for one more question, and we have one from the audience here.
This new agreement, how will it impact Canadian jobs in the next 5 years?
It's always hard to know how any trade agreement will affect individual jobs or even jobs in general. What it will do for sure is reduce some of the uncertainty for investors. So people who planned on opening a plant in Canada will have greater certainty about what the rules will look like for the trade that would be affected by that plant. It might have some impact increasing jobs in the auto sector. That's hard to say. Otherwise, it's probably not going to have a lot of impact because in many respects, it's simply on the big market access issues, it just leaves NAFTA alone. Yep.
All right, well, on behalf of the MPA Class 2019, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Wolfe, for your talk and for answering these questions as well.